is really.
So, Martin, we're scheduled to finish it around 4:20.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to finish earlier or later? I mean, you can stay as long as you like. We can talk.
I think not later. That's fine.
Okay.
I think not later. What's the sort of timings for tomorrow?
So it'll be 9:30 till 4:30.
Okay.
4:30.
Okay. Yes. So I think 4 is probably quite useful. I think
Okay.
for people
Today. Yeah. So
Yeah, I mean,
just taking the session this afternoon.
Yeah, so we can. I mean, it is possible
Okay.
to reduce things. I guess.
Just I think aim for 4 is probably quite useful.
Okay.
Are you planning a break in the afternoon session?
Yeah.
Well, there's
Okay.
a coffee break, but again, with the last session, it can be presented more concisely, so it's
Yeah.
an extended thing. But
We haven't arranged for fresh coffee to come, so there's a cafe downstairs if people need to stretch
It's just
around.
more for a breather.
Yeah, it's anything to do like that. So
Yeah, so the coffee break is meant to be at 3:30.
Yeah.
Just read it, obviously we started a little bit late. So, I mean, what we can do is you can do coffee during the case study session.
During the
Yeah, you could do that then. Have that as a coffee break, and then we can still finish by 4, so we can still keep the same time.
I don't want to disrupt things too much,
no,
but
it's
fine,
I think
it's
for
fine.
just people with sort of childcare or pickups and things
Yeah.
So just trying to.
Just gonna put those case studies. Should we get started? Then?
Yeah.
Okay, so who thinks this is important? Because it's all very well, blah, 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 blah. What does it really mean? Where does this come from? And what's the kind of policy that sits behind it? So this is a speech from our former Prime Minister gave at the World Economic Forum in Davos. This was actually written by Ben Hughes at DCMS, a speech, but really talking about the opportunities presented by technology, but recognising that there are potential concerns that go along with these, and that we need to try and maximise the benefits and minimise the risks. And this covers a wide range of things. The things in this speech are manifested in the industrial strategy as well, and also stimulated EPSRC to fund initiatives such as Orbit. European Union have got a long history in supporting this approach. I mean, you worked on some Framework 7 projects on RI, didn't you?
We did, and they really did hammer down with the ROI. They're very, very keen on it, and I think they've maintained that level of strength actually through the years. They're still just as keen as they were then. So the projects we worked on were seminal in the sense that we were forming some of the principles and concepts that underlie ROI, really understanding what it's about. So they had the idea that they wanted these considerations to be more integrated, but they didn't really know how at that stage. So we were getting responses from society in various ways and through our projects and from the research communities. And I think they just built on it. So it started as science with society, so that was the initial acronym, the FP6 I think. And then for FP7 they said science with and for society.
That's right, SWAFs.
So that's quite significant. Before it was including society and research and innovation, and following it for the FP7 it was not just including them in discussions about what's happening, but also getting them to help steer it, so actually considering the societal challenges that exist.
Yeah, no,
So
that's
it has
very
evolved over time.
good. Very good. I mean, I think anecdotally the EU have put about 350 million euros into research, into responsible innovation. So it's pretty well funded, and that continues. I mean, right through to the end of Horizon 2020, there are SWAFs calls funding this kind of work. And we're doing a project at the moment called Prefet, which is Future and Emerging Technologies, but looking at, so I don't know if you know the FET funding, Future and Emerging, so there are another 2 rounds of that, one in September this year and another one next May, I think, for FET funding. And what they funded us to do this round is to look at the FET technologies that are coming downstream, what they should expect, because they have an issue with the FET programme where less than 50% of the proposals they receive meet the minimum criteria. And one of the areas where they're weak is on ROI, actually addressing the kind of 6 pillars within the EU. So we're doing some work on using advanced analytics to predict what trends are going to come, and then trying to engage with those communities, people working on things like homomorphic computing or technologies in bio or in environment and energy as well. Just to look at what's coming, to try and engage with those communities early, so that if they do put a FET funding proposal in, that all the RI issues are properly addressed in that, and they stand a better chance of getting funded. So that's one of the programs we're doing at the moment. So yeah, so the EU have made a significant commitment. What happens in Horizon Europe remains to be seen. It may move from being a research topic to being something that's seen as embedded in research processes, and is just part of what they do. So it's not really a topic for research, but we don't know that for sure yet. It's not been finalised. But it's a nice, and that's really what Orbit's about. It's at that point where research has happened, methodologies have been developed, and it's now time to actually get on with it and actually implement. Which is, so we're a little bit different from projects of before that have more looked at the researchy aspects. We're talking about implementation.
Okay.
But of course, it's a valid research topic as well. Of course.
Yeah, but this implementation side is really needed, and there are great calls from the community to understand how to do this. So I think Orbit's kind of powerful kind of driver in that direction of things.
So that's the EU and RI, EPSRC. I mean, you've seen statements from them already, but they've made RI training mandatory within CDT calls. How you interpret that mandatory requirement, obviously the different CDTs interpret that in different ways. This is again, very recent update of the various RI initiatives that EPSRC have stimulated. So they put a criteria within the Innovation Knowledge Centres for some years, allegedly. I wasn't aware of that, but they apparently have. It's interesting to look at healthcare in that area. We did a course with the prosthetics and orthotics CDT up at Salford recently. And when you actually start to look at a lot of what they do, they don't call it RRI, but in fact it really aligns with the principles of RRI, so it's embedded in their processes already. And, I mean, not totally surprising, but nice to see that there seems to be a good mapping between what they do in terms of their medical processes and device approval processes and RI itself. So within the TIPS call, within Network Plus, there's an RI requirement in there. Manisha and also Philip tomorrow were involved in the quantum technologies public dialogue, and I was involved as well in that. So it's been something that's been done. Mandatory requirement for the CDT call. Promotion of the area framework, so it's adopting not a what but a how. So it's something that's, and we'll talk about that later. And the last one is us. So these are EPSRC initiatives. So they have really embraced it. And from the EPSRC delivery plan, RI, Responsible Innovation, appears in many different places. So they've gone out and published in a very public forum their commitment to this approach.
You mentioned within the European funding structure, how it's coming into bids to meet criteria associated with bids. Do you see that happening with EPSRC?
Careful what I say. So we have asked, we've said, can you instruct the College of Peer Reviewers to look for these criteria? And when they told us, no uncertain terms, that they couldn't do that. I think they'd like to encourage it, but obviously they can't mandate it. The idea is that the community is meant to sort of moderate itself, really. And so, I mean, just going back to this previous...
Well, they can mandate impact, right?
Well, yeah, indeed, yeah. And I don't know if you know Mark Reed. So I mean, we've obviously had discussions with him, and there's a fair bit of overlap in this stuff. I think perhaps our impact's broader and we look more deeply. We're not necessarily in the metrics; we're into the implications. But there's a lot of overlap between the two.
I would say that some of the calls that are coming out and have come out do in the core document say that they would like to see some evidence of RI. So it is actually the terminology is coming in.
Yeah, but whether the college actually considers it.
I mean that's it.
I guess that applies to a lot of things in review, but it's in the call that's interesting.
So there was a call on human-like computing where it was included in that, but
so
I think you won one of those, didn't you? Human-like computing.
Yeah, I think the group did.
Yeah. So, but I don't know to what extent it was considered in the criteria. And in reality, the question is this an amazing piece of research which is really beneficial overall? Are we going to fund it? Does it include RI or it doesn't at the moment? but we're still going to fund it anyway.
Mm.
There are those kind of decisions, and if we don't fund these people, are they going to leave and move to Stanford?
Yeah.
Which is the bigger issue, the more industrial strategy related issue. To what extent do we retain our incredible body of researchers in this country for our benefit? So I suspect that's why they don't want to say you have to do this, because there are those that won't or resist or do it in different ways. So I'd like to say yes, they do. They are fully supported, but this is about as far as you're going to go. Adopt the area framework, fund a project to deliver training, fund the CDTs to do it.
So that's a kind of key distinction to EU funding, really.
Yeah. It is very, very different.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so
Okay.
we're going to do a bit of switching back and forth. So I'll give an overview of RRI before Martin then moves on to leading the case study segment. But yeah, having had a really nice kind of introduction to some of the kind of complex issues that underpin research and innovation, it's timely to kind of introduce RRI. And today is really about providing an overview of it, so what it holds as its core values, what its principles are, and so on. And through the next couple of days, what we'll be doing is actually starting to apply some of those. So in some ways, this might seem a bit glossy and abstract, but as I said, over the next couple of days, ideas will become a bit more concrete in terms of its application. So just really want to introduce some of the kind of broader ideas today. So as we've established today, and as you'll know from your own work, every technology raises questions. And here we have an image of the printer press. And on its own, it's a rather innocuous technology. It prints words in its initial form, but later on it produces images as well. However, in terms of the impact this has had in how information is disseminated, the speed at which information is disseminated and ideas shared, it's created, huge social transformation in many ways, and some of the results of which we're still seeing today. So the technology in its own sense, in its isolated form, is a device, but actually it's embedded into a socio-technical environment. And as technologies become increasingly pervasive, increasingly sophisticated, so we did see some of the things with drones before, and these things, they may seem quite catastrophic, but actually they're conveying important points that these can have massive implications on society and really challenge some of our fundamental values. So, we really should consider in many ways what the opportunities of the technology are, because we're not trying to hinder innovation, but also some of the other sides of things, such as what the challenges are and what risks they may present. And I think this is a really interesting question. Who is responsible for these technologies? Because they're created, but there are multiple stakeholders who embody them in terms of who use them, who may disseminate them more broadly, and who is actually responsible for the implications of a technology and deciding what these should be. It's a really complex space for purpose of explanation. It may seem quite simplistic, but we do acknowledge that it's really complex. These are complex questions. We saw that just from our discussion of drones and the case study that we discussed earlier. So, a plethora of ethical and human rights concerns can arise in relation to technology, innovation and development. In fact, research and innovation in general can raise these concerns. Privacy and security, massive research areas in their own right at the moment. And I'll just touch on some of these, although I'm sure you're more than aware of many of them. Consent is massive, so there are many mechanisms collecting our data at the moment. It's harvested in many ways. In some respects, we don't know what we're consenting for, because the consent procedures are made so deliberately obtrusive sometimes. There's a lot of work on this, but we don't actually know what we're agreeing for. And if we want to use the service, often we're just forced to say yes. So there are issues with this. But we have had some really controversial cases, such as with the Facebook contagion study or Cambridge Analytica, where data was harvested without users' consent and used or sold in various ways. So for the Cambridge Analytica case, data was harvested through a seemingly mundane quiz, but this was then sold on and it was able to elicit things about political standings and so on, which have quite severe consequences and has had supposedly had severe consequences in terms of how people voted and the outcome of various public debates. Autonomy and agency, again, there are huge concerns with the recent developments in robotics over what impact that will have on human agency, and these are very real concerns. We've got a call at the moment that, we won an award, Marina won that award, and they're looking at robotic devices and the robotic black box.
So it's the fellowship.
It's the fellowship, and really it's about, we have these things, they're making autonomous decisions, we really don't know how they're making their decisions, but they're integrated into the socio-technical world. Who's responsible for these? What does this mean for us as humans in relation to these? And so these are raising really interesting ethical dilemmas. And power asymmetries is another one. So we've got this influx of these massive social media companies and these huge corporations, which, almost as powerful as governments now, or more powerful in some respects. And this is creating a dichotomy between the users and these companies. But I also attended a national scientist debate recently, and there's some quite high-profile people from different governments and things that had attended this, and they were concerned about access to research and innovation. So if certain more wealthy parts of the world have access and others don't, and we're looking at really, really sophisticated technologies, what does this mean for things like the standing world order? Does it mean that there is such a huge gap that the hierarchy can remain unchallenged? So some of these issues, again, might seem quite catastrophic, but they are seriously being debated and discussed. I've been to a lot of different conferences where people not just from the research community but from elsewhere are starting to have these discussions and raise these concerns. A lot of these are contextualised, so in your own work you might be able to think of things which are concerning or which may concern you, but we just wanted to raise, and through RRI, the community just wants to raise that actually we should be considering these things. They're important to consider. The world today kind of needs this kind of consideration of technologies beyond just technology's sake, or innovation beyond just innovation's sake. So what is RRI, having taken all this into mind? So I have a couple of statements which I'd like to share. So the first is that RRI is a way to do research that takes a long-term perspective on the type of world in which we want to live. And this will have come through our discussion so far today. So it's not just an ethical approach, which is kind of tick box exercise that you conduct in relation to your project. If it's accepted, you can forget about it. Really, it's trying to integrate mechanisms into research and innovation processes that make them more responsible, or that help make them more responsible. But beyond this, it asks that maybe we can look at how research and innovation can be more aligned to societal values and needs, so that we can be more proactive in shaping the future trajectory of society and technology together. And because it embeds these mechanisms, it can also be argued that RRI strengthens research and innovation projects, because you're so contextually aware of what's going on in the ecology in which you're working that you are able to adapt to changes. You don't just introduce a kind of innovation project which is then rejected. Actually, you know what's going on in your environment and you're able to respond to it. And you're also giving people the chance to contribute to it, which can be a really powerful thing, like getting perspectives from outside your direct community of communication. And, this really kind of broadens the role of a researcher beyond that kind of traditional ivory tower analogy of academics. We're really understanding our role in society as a research community, helping to shape and contribute towards solving some of these longer term issues. Yeah, so this has kind of come across. I won't keep repeating things because I think we're kind of coming to some kind of concise points. But really you are producing results that are better suited to societal needs in an ideal sense. And I really like this statement actually, that although it refers to policy level, I like this aspect of it. So the best science for the world. So we're looking to create the best science for the world and not just the best science in the world. And I think that, historically maybe, especially where technology was concerned, technology was developed just for technology's sake. But now we're actually looking at what society needs more broadly and developing technology for that purpose. So although some of these statements are a bit repetitive.
The difference between science and technology.
Yeah, and also society, and then you've got the natural environment. So, but I think that the point is just that things should be considered in isolation. I think that's the point that should come across. And this more holistic approach can help kind of move society towards a more positive pathway and help avoid some of the disruption we've seen where things have been developed that have maybe already potentially challenged some of our fundamental human values. So it's just a more proactive approach. Some people argue that it is very idealistic, and there has been a lot of debate in this area. But at the same time, as I think somebody raised earlier, a lot of this, we can't just ignore a lot of these things. A lot of these developments do have implications which we do need to consider. And we do perhaps need to start having practical ways in which we can start to consider these things. This is very high level, so over the next couple of days, hopefully some of this more abstract level of consideration might become clearer, but those are some of the kind of overarching views of what RRI hopes to embed in the research and innovation process. So are we going to do another switch, Martin? Because I think we'll move on to group case studies now, and then I'll come back and actually share what the principles of RRI are.
Nice to meet you. Very good, thank you. So we're going to work now in groups, and we have 3 case studies for your delight.
Do you want me to hand those up?
I'll talk through first. So we have one on geoengineering. This is a case study. The principle is to build large subsea structures underneath icebergs, stop the bottoms of them melting. That's the idea. So it's a very large scale civil engineering project. So the middle one is a quantum technology, quantum communications technology called quantum secure direct communications, and this is a protocol for proving that a communications channel is secure using entangled quanta, and then once that channel has been proved, you then send information in the clear. So it's an interesting, that's a rather scary approach to telecommunication security. And the last one is computers. This is a technique developed by many people, but also including Leroy Cronin at Glasgow, and it's looking at kind of convergence of computer science and chemistry. One of his approaches is to use 3D printers to create custom reactionware to produce particular types of drug compounds, but then putting the reactionware back into the 3D printer and automating the manufacturing process. And he's proved this with ibuprofen, which is a very expensive way of making a very cheap pill, but also in other things as well. So 3 kind of case studies, and what we'll be doing with each one is I'll be asking you in groups to produce these answers. So what are the applications? This particular approach, some of them is quite clear, others it's quite broad. What are the potential positives and for whom? Negatives and for whom? Who are the stakeholders in these? More broadly, are the outcomes for their kind of use cases could they be seen as transformational or incremental? What alternative sort of dual use applications are there? So where else could this be applied to make a difference? Are there interdependencies? So it's all very well to say that this is an amazing technology and it will be totally transformational, but if it relies on something else working which is not yet proven, does that negate its impact completely? Because that happens. Do we need controls or regulations? So these are the that middle one is wrong. It's actually quantum communication. So you have three choices: geoengineering, quantum communications, or computers. So, any volunteers? Three teams. We could have 4 teams. 3 teams. Any volunteers for any of these?
I'll take the engineering one.
Yeah,
Oh,
I'm
so-
looking forward to creating the cloud, yeah.
Okay, so
I'll do quantum.
okay, very
Be
good.
around for a while.
So
If
you
I-
maybe have
Any computers?
computers.
so that's a geoengineering.
Do you want the groups to gather?
Yeah, if you could, that would be great.
Do you
So
want computers over here?
Yeah. Yeah, we can do
And
that.
then
Geoengineering.
geoengineering over here?
Yeah.
So computers, geoengineering.
that's another geoengineering one. So
Yeah, don't have to move.
Okay, so this is geoengineering.
that's another one.
This is geoengineering too.
How many?
We need one more at the moment. Is only 2 one more geoengineering.
Okay, yeah, got that. We can. So there's the geos.
Yeah.
Another
So
geoengineering.
quantum, you wanted quantum?
There you go.
Computers.
Computers, okay. Bear with me a second.
Computers.
Bear with me a second. What do we have to surprise?
Move my phone.
I did my the cryo.
We're going to keep running around. So,
Do you know it?
very well.
Yeah, all right. We did a workshop with him and EPSERC on kind of where that might go. He's got a Chrome group, hasn't he?
You're local.
Did you end up on Twitter, by any chance? Did you end up on Twitter?
That was interesting because there's a lot of the farmer community there as well, kind of commenting on the approach. So there's another one. So we've actually been watching some of his YouTube videos on the third day, actually, getting into a particular application of
Not the one where he's running then.
Not the
no.
one you called, right? When he was talking about his kids.
Yeah, not that one. No.
What's that, Martin?
That's computers. Have you got enough? You got, need,
One
need
more.
one. There we go. One more. There we go. So what do we need now? So the quantum.
Yeah.
Quantum.
Yeah. Okay. We can do that. This one. One quantum.
Got one quantum.
No, just go to executions. It's like
Registering students.
They set a new system. They set a new
executions that this is
What do you do in Europe?
We don't.
You
Second
don't.
one over here.
Yeah,
So
for lectures we don't.
Actually, sorry, that last one was short. Actually, it's the last page.
Sorry, that's what's
Sorry. Not that you need them, but
No, lectures are not compulsory. It's just labs. To assign you to labs and tutorials of the labs and then.
how many more quantum do we need?
We need 2 more.
2 more, please.
2. Right, that's 1. Quantum. We should have another one. Yes, there we go.
Their problem.
They can't complain.
They can't complain. They're adults. You should be infantilising our students, recognising that it's like a gym. I'm the first year course director, so we've got a couple in a couple of weeks' time.
Thanks very much. Cheers, right.
The first 2 courses like a gymnasium.
So 45, yeah.
Yes, we have 45 minutes.
Yeah, they're subscribing and they're
Yeah,
asking
until
for
half
money. It's
2.
for them not to use it.
Yeah.
But they are
So the idea is if you've got a computer to hand, and if you can put PowerPoint slides, that would be great. So
growing up process is
We've got one.
No.
students.
you could do a little dance.
Yeah,
or
we
something.
can-
If you advise them, teachers just an extension of school. No, then they're not really registered in the university because when they go to work, if they don't turn up to work, they'll get the sack. There won't be someone there holding their hands.
Somebody will check that without work.
That's true, that's it.
Yeah, well, this is to check that without work.
That's kind of true, but we're not employing them in the same way, so I don't think that that's direct technology.
Right.
And moreover, if they start their own small business or become self-employed, they've got to have personal motivation. They have motivation to go and get a job.
Full blast.
Okay. So it was.
doing? Any questions? Yeah, I'm sure you guys know a lot more about this. I mean, the thing with this, I wouldn't necessarily get too bogged down in detail. The key is everything's in the abstract.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, their idea,
Yeah, it's a computer.
the tangled contour,
Yeah.
coherence of
Where's the rest of the
the
bar?
maintenance of the coherence, all the proof you need that the channels are being snooped on.
Okay.
It's a big assumption.
So the maintenance and the tangled state is the principle.
Yeah, so they're basically, but if we do that periodically to check the integrity of the channel, but whatever we send them is guaranteed to be secure.
No.
We're talking about sending it clear, not sending it clear. Which it's all very well until you find out that your coherence is not a text, and all that unencrypted data is open to anybody to read and do with as they read. So I think it's a hell of an
the more
assumption.
traffic you've got, the more traffic you've got, and the more it becomes a problem as well.
No, that's not what we're doing. They send half the photons, so they prepare a bunch of photons in entangled states. They send half of them, and then they take measurements, and if those measurements are correlated between the two, you can prove that they're still entangled and you have a secure channel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then Alice prepares
No, I don't really see
the other half of the
either where the
photons
hype or the
in order
controversy.
to encode zeros or ones
It's that.
by
I think that
these states.
it's
here,
over
step
but it's
4.
really good.
So Alice
A lot of fire
sends
and
those half of, she
highlight
prepares
and
those
stuff.
half of the photons
And they've been doing this for a long
to
time.
encode zeros and ones
Three
on this entangled state.
reaction.
She sends those photons.
Oh yeah.
Bob can
And
only
then, these
receive the zeros and
digitization
ones
just
because he
based on
has the other
scanning
half of the entangled state.
synthetic
But
procedures.
I mean, this is really not that
and
much
workable.
different from quick glassware
So
or
it's
dry, right?
So
No,
if I
but it
The
means
difference is that you can do it
It means you can ship a
cheap.
quote
Use
to
different zeros and
and
ones.
you just
So if somebody was to intercept those,
do
It's
it.
the manufacturing technique or
they wouldn't be able to access the information anyway.
No,
because they don't
It's
know.
No,
not-
he's saying
it's
he's
not
saying you
the
could,
same.
if you've got a need for a specific drug in a certain place, you could just ship a 3D printer with the starting materials
Yeah.
and press a button. It'll make the reaction there. It'll do the reactions and give you an amount without having to
You
make
can only read it
multi
by having
kilos.
the other half of the
So
entangled
if
state.
the application kind of design,
That's
oh, right.
So-
So you have the chemicals already inside the raw material.
So-
In the
You have containers of the precursor.
Nobody
Yeah.
in the
It's kind of
middle.
hard to think of it
Well,
all.
yes.
Oh,
It's a
oh,
bit
yeah.
like when you get, you know, when you order a box
Yeah.
where you,
Yeah.
like a recipe box, and it gives you all the ingredients in there and then a set of instructions for how to
You
make it.
cannot use that
Yeah,
policy.
well, so
It's the same
we
thing.
should-
It's like one of
So
those.
You can read those
So you have the instructions which are in
some
full,
of the issues
without
with it,
and the difference here is that
some of
rather
the
than having
issues
to
with
use your
this
own
is
pots and
it
pans,
assumes that
it will
so,
also
for example, with
print the
the
pots and pans for you as well.
So,
But also,
every
the,
single
you
photon
don't have to have a multi-million-pound plant setup to make one particular
And you
drug.
also
You
don't
can
need
make
any expertise.
Yeah.
and then
You don't have to
second
pay
photon, so an
trans
attacker could steal
synthetic
the second
chemist.
photon, and you would then know that.
So if you wanted to make any
So there is a possibility
opiates
to
for the
steal that
choice,
second
Yeah.
photon.
you could just
But in this case,
generate
Could be
the code
applied to glaciers.
and then
in this
somebody
case,
can
you
make
can send in a
whatever
million.
So
opiate
the
they
legislation would have to be centred around availability of precursors,
Which
large-
already
which is
is.
already
It's very low.
The one thing will be the quality control and quality assurance. So yes, it can make
So this is very similar to quantum
it is
computing,
distributed
but
in
it is
different.
different.
Yeah.
But what about the
There are keys involved.
Yeah.
Will
You don't need
it
an
be
entangled
quality
state to
control
do
itself?
distribution.
No, so
So-
the key is sent
Quality
by
assurance.
entangled
But in
state,
principle it should be the same
information
because
is
the
sent
reagents
by-
are the same.
information
There
is sent
shouldn't be any difference because it's done on the
Yeah.
But you're right,
Yeah.
you do need some validation that nothing, one of the steps hasn't gone down.
The board of the entanglement is your way to ensure that nobody
Even the recipes are the same.
In this case,
no, in the QKD.
Tested all
I don't think any
Yeah.
No,
to
QKD
ensure that
Yeah.
Right, so habitats as well, I guess.
that will be one of the things.
Yeah.
Well,
So
eco
it works like this. So I prepare an entangled
You need the
I keep one half and I
yeah,
send
we
the other half.
keeping the small
So
scale, right?
so
Most
if I
of the
know
way
it's
yeah.
sensitive about communication, I measure my photon.
So if you're
Alex
in,
measures her
in
photon, Bob measures his
if you're in an area
and then you
which
exchange
does not
classical
have
It
a big
uses
pharmaceutical
the,
company,
classical
but you
information.
need access to
thing,
a drug
example,
in a
sends
remote location,
basically we don't have
I
that.
depend
and many
this
drugs
is what I got.
degrade
100,
over
100.
time, so they need to be
And
made
then
on
Alex
that
compares it
location
to
and
her
distributed
measurements,
in
and she
that
shows
location.
the opposite.
Then
the raw material.
And in the case
so the raw
that
materials
the
come with the kit, right? So you would take the raw materials, but they
say,
would just be
What was the effect?
very simple chemical
Pretty
precursors.
good depending upon.
So you would ship the precursors
Yeah,
as
30%.
a final drug, because
They
mostly
even say that it's
precursors are stable and the drug isn't necessary. So say it was like an antiviral,
Application.
Yeah.
and you're in a remote location where you need to quickly distribute antivirals because there's an epidemic,
Oh, okay.
and you don't have Pfizer next door, then you could potentially sort of closest possible to that location, you could set up your computer and produce the antiviral
So
in principle.
Do you realise that it's dropped?
And so the
But if
people
I
that
later
you would need
we-
the experts with you wouldn't need to be an expert in making the drug, just administering it.
I mean, the main issue is centered around the, as you mentioned, the sort
But that's what
of,
it was designed.
What you want to do is
clean, I can't remember what the phrase is, actually,
Okay, so
which basically requires a key
30%
exactly as long as the
packaging
message.
plus.
Yeah.
So however fast you want to send the message,
Okay.
you need to generate the key.
Well, we can circle round, but let's
So the key rate is a very crucial thing.
Oh,
The key rate is
positive
very,
outcomes.
very slow.
Somebody's
They're
going to
like
build
kilobits
this,
per
so somebody's
second.
going to model that.
But you consider
Uh,
what is
job creation, job creation.
No, it could be something in your
This can be targeted at any molecule that requires a process that's compatible with the materials. That's the limitations, the solvent compatibility and reagent compatibility.
messages are exchanged in the
Because it's not in glassware, it's in polymer vessels.
because there are booster
Yeah.
systems
So
all along the path.
they make
So we send the
they try
signal
to
when we
I
accept
think
it's going to be
as
great.
they mentioned in the ad,
But it gets boosted
the
and
level
which is fine.
you can't do that with a
new
quantum state.
regulatory
I guess there are some
I
guess there are some
No, well, so there's
So
going to be no
you know,
coding.
this final paragraph, it identifies the benefit in terms of
maybe the people who have the money, the people who can.
a demand that's sufficient to be commercially viable but insufficient to justify fat scale production. I mean, that's the key.
So the very
Okay, so
short
somebody has to pay
range.
for it.
So here,
Possible.
it's
And then it touches on the
Yeah.
regulatory
Yeah.
framework.
10 kilometers. And they do say this technique has a high capacity when QKD. So still, I would expect it to be
So
quite
we
low.
apply for point-to-point communications.
I mean, you could say that we should.
But clearly not for internet communications.
I mean, there's not a lot of.
What are they
Just
saying?
think
Just
about
putting
that association, that
Yeah, it's a
notation,
grant,
isn't it?
right?
That's valid, isn't it?
So I think one of the big selling points about QKD and quantum communication
during the
is
fabrication.
that in the world where we
What the
expect quantum,
ecosystem creator of glass is like.
so one of the
Probably running.
canonical examples of
Yeah, I
quantum
think so.
Why not?
Think
Well,
about
I mean, it's going to be a lot of it's going to be a lot of aggregate which needs to be which needs to come from
so
somewhere.
for example,
So
banks
it
in
would
the
mine
minute
from
will use
somewhere.
RSA encryption
Yeah.
to
So-
encrypt our bank accounts and our medical records or whatever else. And one of the big selling points of quantum
Yeah, so disrupt the ecosystem.
it can't be hacked by
Locally and
I mean, Shaw's algorithm was yet to be proven, and it runs on a hybrid computer, so quantum.
okay.
Let's go wrong.
Hybrid computers to run.
Yeah.
Would this be one of not in my black kind of thing
salesman
where
Well,
D-Wave
the same
international interference?
D-Wave dilution.
People
We're
trying
doing
to
that.
sell stuff around
Yeah.
That's it. That's it. Quantum computing.
But
It's not.
I mean, it is in this area, so you're heavy industrial activity near your some
So you
country
need
like
47
WWF.
qubits to create current RSA. I would say it's
Doesn't Antarctica
2,048
is also a bit
bits.
friendly who owns it.
So you need 47 qubits in order to show
It's
down
a
the
sovereignty.
have that
And
in
you spell out
in
sovereign.
And we're not at that. We're at
well, so
No,
D-Wave have
the
like
problem- I thought
5,000
there's
qubits, right?
GS
So then you've
somewhere.
got,
Yeah,
like you say, that's an D-Wave.
I was just waiting for the red line to.
The difference between an annealer and a full quantum computer is an
It might not
annealer
work.
can only make
It might not work.
entanglements between the neighbour
And
qubits.
if people
Whereas
think,
in a general
and
quantum
maybe
computer, you need
people might think,
any
oh, hey, we
arbitrary
solved the
qubit
problem
to be
here.
able to make an
Maybe we
entanglement
solved
with
the
any
same
arbitrary
problem.
qubit.
Um,
But
Yeah.
Google.
I guess sort of one example where it would be quite
And
useful
also,
is if you
giving
the
justification
sort of
for
radio
people
label
don't want to do anything
so
about it.
So then you
certain
ask, can
things
they
with traces,
propose
then
your
they
algorithm?
must
You
be
actually
made
still
close
not.
to the
Unsolvable,
point of view.
Because
So
yeah,
otherwise they
so,
degrade
yeah,
over
so
time. So we had like
because
this
quantum
being a
computer
problem
is
at the moment
basically
in
an
high
analog computer.
of
So if
the
you remember the old
Brexit
days,
issue, and we won't be able to get radio labelled.
Right.
Compounds
One of the
will
reasons
be
they
able
don't
to say it's all in these
so-
European
so
society.
People are
But
living within the
It-
pathway
it
line.
was still sort of simplifying the process to make
If I send a
drug
1,
where the
and you receive a
actual
0.9,
MRI
you can
is
very
or
easily say
whatever
that's a 1,
Yeah.
right?
being
For a quantum computer,
if you're making it in the
because it's,
hospital, then it would
I'm
it would create
sending
less waste.
20% of a
You will
1,
change the
80%
weather
of
patterns,
a 1.
everything.
So it's animals, right?
I'm not
Yeah.
So
sure
if you
about
receive
this.
21%,
Yeah.
if I send 20% 1, and you receive 21% 1,
The chances
You've got
are
no way to
quite
tell
how
very
many
highest compared to the
So it takes about,
to distribute
so
the
this is a
manufacturing
very
system.
Yeah.
very research,
Locally
but
at each
Might be.
estimates
Yeah,
are that it
industry,
might take
industry,
1,000 physical qubits
centralized.
to make up one
Uh,
error-corrected logical
yeah.
qubit.
Well, and here it talks
the
about the
people doing the
detectors
work.
being 75% efficient.
It's outsourcing the
No,
research.
well,
Any errors,
I think you're wasting.
just correcting.
You would only
Even
make
if it
what you need
transmits
to
when
this,
the
rather than making a
detector
whole batch
gets
You're gonna double
and
bust the
chance
country.
of
where
getting
it's
it right.
degrading over
That's
time.
And they
So-
think there's 1,000.
You would also need a lower dosage because more of the drug would be active.
That 1,000 number depends
So there are
sensitively on things
Some
like
some of these things
how
have got
efficiently
side
you can
effects as
generate
well.
single
Well, there needs
So
to
when
be
you
some
put in
how
high
efficiently
doses
you can measure
because
things.
you
So
want to get the
there's-
how
activity
efficiently
out
you
back
can
the
transmit
too.
them.
So there's also that kind of issue.
That goes into how many physical qubits you need to make one error.
But obviously then you have to distribute radioactive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can't think of anything else, so move on to the next
way
one.
of selling
Yeah.
Well, it's
Transformational
genius in a way because
for
forever they'll be the first
It'll be
quantum
incremental.
computers, right?
It's not really changing the
And I mean, it's very controversial. Like
Well,
whether they see even
You're
an
gonna
advantage.
slow down this.
slowing down,
Yeah,
slowing
yeah.
down. I mean, you could argue that the process is transformative, but the change is incremental.
A transformational incremental improvement.
Brown.
Um,
He wrote
I would say incremental improvement.
fiction.
Improvement.
Which is a quantum
I
AI
mean,
based.
you have to contrast this to the other option, which is what they were saying.
Yeah, someone having to pay them for that.
Yeah, so these are, so that is the contrast. It's a local intervention versus
So we should try and do sort of
Yeah, go
this
for it.
question.
Secure photon transmission.
So
That's the application. Secure photon transmission.
Secure
Yeah.
communication.
Stakeholders could be medicine,
so
Okay.
secure.
It's hard to argue it's possible.
Remote areas.
It's pretty ambitious, isn't it? It's a lot of
So
risk
we've
involved.
got banking,
They build
military, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Wasn't sure invented by
Um,
the US
Scalable
military
systems.
It's also
yeah,
very-
dissident.
It's quite long term as well, so
I mean,
it's going to work out. It's going to be over a period of decades when you figure out what
Story
Oh,
that I
yeah.
heard.
which point
So
opinions
then
may have
there's an
changed,
issue that
modelling may
because
have
there's
changed,
a big
because
battle
of
over
papers and-
companies primarily based in Israel offering
So it's
services
the positive
to
and negative
spy
outcomes.
smartphones
Positive,
and things like that, and it
I guess
generally
there's
is very
no,
targeted on dissidents, particularly
Yeah, we did
in
that.
Eastern
Let's
countries.
put that
So basically,
I don't
human
know how
rights
that goes for.
activists,
Um,
But there
lawyers,
is also another issue with this one, which is
and,
around if you
other
imagine the
people
amount
are
of
also
money
going to want
Yeah.
you've got to
secure
apply to build this,
communications
what
and
else are you
have
not
a
doing?
as well
And
as
that's
state
why
Yeah.
building it.
Activists.
Whether
Yes,
it's climate change
stakeholders in
related,
medical
medical or
sectors,
something else.
clinics, hospitals.
So the question is, if you're building
At
this
the
big
minute,
mud wall or whatever it is,
Yeah.
If
What else are you
security
not
forces,
doing?
for example, want to
Materials.
listen to terrorists,
potentially
then they usually can do
damaging
that.
to society.
But with
All sorts of chemicals.
Okay.
if terrorists use quantum,
So
yeah, I mean, you do stop the.
So you can add in terrorists as well, because they would love this kind of.
I know you know it already. So
Yeah, I mean, it's positive and negative. Most people who make chemicals will be thinking along these lines for quite a few years. He's just putting together some of his computer skills with his hobby of 3D printing.
Yeah.
Global warming.
But it's the same thing elsewhere.
You can
There's a theory, for example, that people are
you can see it for very particular applications. But I mean,
although they can't see them,
some of this reaction where it's very complex, and then the
complex.
prototyping of the process is even more complex. And then what you do once you've manufactured this stuff, measuring whether it's how pure it is.
Well, that's the metrology.
It's going down a bit.
Well, that's something analysing it once you've got it. I think will argue that you've got
Basically, this relies on us not messing it up more than we have.
So it depends on what you make. That's something it's limited by the materials that you use. To use a 3D printer, I think it's a small window of properties you can use for the reaction. Most of this will be limited to non-aggressive solvents or water. And then also the reagents that you're using haven't got to interact with the pollen. I think there's a lot of stuff that needs to be developed, but
I think it's a grand vision though.
But the
reality of application is quite narrow.
But the biochemists have gone down this route to a large degree already.
Well, the question is, are
think what they can do with DNA and all the rest of it.
Incremental.
A lot of biochemists just use black boxes to process the multi-component gut that we've analysed before. One compound that's there in the
positives or
nanoscale, I guess.
Yes, it's
it's not transformational in the sense that you're trying to prevent things from changing. So it's kind of like
because the limitation is how long the chain they can produce the amino acids.
You're not really changing how
still
people
quite
live
short, but at some point the innovation will get there.
I mean, it all relies on
so I think that's maybe
understanding the fundamental
doesn't
bond making process, so that you can have a statistical realization of a probability of making the right bond.
So
as well, like in the
Well, there's an issue of scale, isn't there? It's all right for experimental
addressing
things,
the
but if
symptoms
you were
rather
actually
than
using
that feels more like
modest local scale.
Well, I don't know. There's no, the concentration of drugs is really small. Most of the problem actually, I think, in terms of drug manufacture is the and the formulations of the actual pills or that you're actually going to administer, getting the solubility right, putting it into the amount of a drug is almost tiny. Just bulked up with things to solubilise. And that part isn't there, right? They haven't got, it's just making the actual active.
Civil and military. Could this be someone use this to like put it in terms of underwater phase?
Maybe it's or is that application?
I think they've chosen some examples of
required.
Yeah, infrastructure as
that
well.
they used as
Such as national grid,
best chemicals.
railways also.
You could imagine that if you were making some photoactive material to go into a hydrogel,
okay, so that's the positives you can use. So I guess that's kind of like
Do we need to? How deeply these things are?
So
I think there is somewhere.
I don't know how you
below
the table, so they give an example about the amount of soil and material to pump is on similar scale, so they say
Yeah, I mean obviously
anything between 0.1 and 1.5 cubic kilometers of material.
yeah, I mean it's taking
alternative
So they give an example, so the palm Jumeirah in Dubai was 0.1
okay.
it would be very easy to share the
and
code
0.3
online.
cubic in Hong Kong for the apple. And 1.6
Even things like diet pills, you know,
So
be
they are
very easy to do that kind of thing.
It is there will be something
Another
else
problem
that
that
however
is
but that's the
who's going to
small
administer the drug, as you say, if you're going to be
others it's
injecting
yours,
things.
and
Like you want to be able to give these things to medical professionals that are also going to monitor the patient.
But that's not like
Because distributing drugs is not just
It's
giving
one
someone
thing.
pills, it's
we
have to
monitoring. There's always side effects,
Yeah,
so
Reliant
that's
on
somebody has to
if only in the
monitor
logistics.
the
the generator, the addiction.
Oh yeah, moving this stuff around.
Yeah.
Good point.
20 kilos.
that's one side. So cube that, yeah.
Reliant,
It has
reliant
a kind of risk of
components.
privacy.
Yeah. So, like, don't eliminate it.
Because if it is a kind of distributed the technological challenge of distributed systems,
Yeah.
Maybe
How do you actually
that company seriously
build things that are
Systems. This one's an interview.
in a large scale, right? It's not made of
they can control people.
You just like push it over.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a point of
Let's do these ones, yeah. Keep going.
The software level.
Cost.
The main thing is taking the synthesis of sophisticated chemistry out of the hands of skilled practitioners into someone who doesn't actually know anything.
No, it's 2 and 3 and 4.
That's usually where the control level is.
Oh, sorry, okay, sorry.
impacting something
For the
that's
problems,
somewhere
okay,
else.
okay.
You need
They
to
can
regulate.
control
Okay,
the
I've got
behavior
2 more
of
negative outcomes. The range.
the ecosystem.
So they have changed
The ecosystems, and there's also the fact that you are actually changing
Oh yeah, okay.
climate locally.
The patient, the people
Not just local, but like
can
you're making having an impact elsewhere.
addicted to that particular
But you're going to need some
Yeah,
evidence to be able to do that, and nobody
that
knows.
particular company.
Fair enough.
Okay, what were your further
Yeah,
two
I think
there?
addiction
So
is
range
I think we're fairly
is
confident it
and
will change the ecosystem.
not what we're
Yeah.
Ecosystem.
We have this, it's in the headlines at the moment,
Killing the
right,
local
with
farmers.
addiction to
For who? So is it for who?
It
Okay,
needs to be
yes. So
international
it's
as well.
for.
Yeah.
So do you want to add them in?
Brackets.
Yeah, just for who? Yeah.
So increased security for the
prescriptions.
The current prescriptions.
Yeah.
There's
No, this is for how much is
Then
By listing this, you can list the
countries
thing.
with China as well.
That's basically an article.
Less stable government.
Or
They want to
respect
control
privacy and consumer
University students who can say, I want to have.
military.
I think the
Well, that's not so much.
obvious
gotta
ones
be
are
how
the
many
sort
kilometres
of Breaking
long.
Bad
Agree.
kind of
patients.
It's not like, you know,
but
you
there's
have
also,
some
this can happen at a state level too.
Perhaps. Although maybe you
So reduce your fraud.
Banks, companies.
It's probably like where do you actually put the thing? There's no regulation for that.
Yeah, how do you
Okay.
control them?
Consumers.
Keep them off their faces.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
This has to be
I think we've got-
And they used to do this in the army.
Yeah.
As well.
UN or
And the military.
TCC or
Yeah,
some kind of.
there's.
What have we got?
So-
There in
so,
Chile,
yeah.
we haven't got enough.
Negative, so
Code
crime,
applications, some
terrorists, right?
Terrorism, general organised criminals.
And I don't know which
don't
one
think
it
it is
is.
organised
This-
crime.
Charities and things, you know,
Yeah.
people that go out
Maybe the mafia, but maybe the mafia or some really wealthy criminal organisation.
All confidence in.
Wealthy criminal organisation like the US government.
Yeah,
exactly. So we're
the workers,
government, military, and companies and consumers. We can all get.
Yeah. Negative outcomes for people.
What could be the alternatives?
Limited reliability. So
These
components.
Definitely,
All.
if it works, then it
Cost.
seems
Yeah,
that
go.
alternative.
Pretty much,
Yeah.
right?
Consumers, government can pay for that.
What are the alternative applications? Well, I was thinking poisons, terrorism, recreational drugs,
Cost is consumers, yeah.
diet, like I say, diet
Cost is
poison.
consumers as well, I think.
Anything where very small
Range is more
molecule affect chemicals
military
involved.
Well, I guess all, yeah.
What is that, sorry?
Okay. Okay.
health and
How are we
safety,
doing?
the thought
So
was, I mean,
I guess
what
we've
would
got a lot
be
of
different
stakeholders
for
here.
So an
you're sending
example
people down to
guess
600
is-
meters.
Are
we not in the
possibly cosmetics,
It's going to be.
So just showing people
where
use listed
they started at the beginning and they didn't regulate
I mean, there's definitely going to be some.
clinics well
I
enough,
mean, it's
and they
something that
were
we
all
haven't
given
done before. So
Botox
there's going to be some
dish
Yeah.
out,
Right.
and the consequences of not
So I
applying
would say,
for
I'd say more broadly the citizen, because if the information is
Society,
being,
society.
yes, society as a whole, because if the materials are being encrypted,
and the same with fillers. I mean, you see people
Power-
going
power
around with
consumer.
fillers,
No.
ruins
Inputs.
their faces, and
someone who's just
Is that the same for patients?
the same thing with this.
Yeah.
You know, when people can't get access
I would
to
say
it,
all of those things,
Yeah.
consumer information,
industry is
voter,
regulated.
user of banking services,
Yeah.
Yeah.
taxpayer.
Who provides
Really
the
imagine
treatment?
it where you don't have an action involved
how many
in infected
cubic
children.
Those
Those kind of medicaments that they
This
give
is the recipient.
prescriptions
One
for
and a
all
half.
good use.
Instead of putting an X in a box, we could press a button on a
One point
computer.
six.
Size.
I hope it
We've
works
never did
effectively.
anything voting in this country.
I hope it works better
So
than the
if it doesn't
experience of electronic voting,
doesn't
which
This could be 1 to 100.
because that's an
From 1 and 100.
pressing
3D
button,
printers
the
are
wrong
fairly
vote
cheap.
comes up on
Yeah,
the screen.
I mean, not like
Yeah.
well,
The
what's the
Okay,
size?
So whoever
No,
controls
it's
the
not too
software
expensive.
controls
What's
the
some of the biggest things?
The only thing, it depends, okay, so really sophisticated drugs are not possible. So for things where you need other innovations,
So,
certain drugs have really complicated functional groups that might be, there might be a sort of,
point.
I don't know,
Yeah, so
Like,
300,000
say,
cubic
So it's incremental because
So-
it's
the
So
steric
they
properties
want
of
1.6
that drug are more
times
important
10 to the
actually than
9,
the
right?
structure, well, than the
You have to be looking at composition.
composition. So
divide that by
those
what is it?
kinds of
Okay, so
things are quite
3.6.
challenging. So to be able to have enantiosis activity in
So
there.
you only need 10,000 one time. But the requirement is that there's a written procedure.
Yeah.
Please be developing software that can just go to a journal, scan the written experimental, and transform that directly to code to feed into one of these.
So someone has to deliver or to provide the.
need 10,000
The original experimentation has to be done previously to provide a sufficiently reliable procedure for this all to work. You know, you have to be getting high yields, otherwise you're going to have problems. So all the separation steps here are going to get
But a lot of this is in the patent literature, and sometimes it's quite hard for a human to extract all the information from the patent literature, but AI can do it much easier because you can put all of the literature together.
But the chemical engineer at the university can do it maybe.
Yes, but it would just take a lot longer. Well, I mean, anyone can do it, right? I mean, the issue in making drugs is not that we can already just search the literature and find the procedure and do it ourselves. We can already do that, but you can't. The point is you can't sell it because you don't have the because either it's under patent
That's something we haven't considered.
or you don't
This
have
is,
control. But you already know that this already happens, right? Because you can already go online and you can buy various different coloured pills that Wish.com, right? I mean, you can just already do that. My mother-in-law does it quite regularly. She buys
the name is developing a new technology. How do you actually
pastes
move
and things actually,
so much
from places that are not regulated.
You have to add water into it. And you have to keep in mind
What are you doing? About 5 minutes? Showtime. Showtime up in 5 minutes. So.
During that process,
No pressure.
I think it's not, yes. It's limited in applicability because it's only point to point.
can't broadcast.
The point with this is that it's not drug discovery. It's not drug discovery. All the information is already available. The computer reads the scientific literature and it turns it into code. Then this part turns that code into the process for making that drug. So this is just one example.
It's just a production process whereby you do not need a warm body with a pair of hands.
Yeah, if you're talking to an individual, broadcast is a different means of communication.
The code is already open access. You could do this right now.
Tuned into strange
You send it to you now.
radio stations that just broadcast strings of numbers, often not in English.
Yeah, this is all already open. It's already
Sending broadcasting a signal to multiple people
is
at one time adds to
the
the code.
3D printer. And then the audio.
If you ever have time to Google numbers
scenarios
stations,
here.
Then you need to find somebody stupid enough to inject it.
I don't think there are any.
But you need to have some sort of knowledge. No, we don't actually dishing out products. There's more to it. In a pill, there's more than just the active.
What are the applications in the paper and what do you think of not
So you need to know. Don't just need to know how to make this thing. Certain drugs are encapsulated in things that will make sure. The way you administer a drug depends on what your body does to it. Many drugs you can't just swallow them.
But that is an outcome. When you have this kind of product, you have to have
And some of them, won't be transported in your blood anyway. So there's
local fauna, you're also
things that sit
you
in
have to live.
It's not. This is not like. And also, I think people read it and think they're like just printing the drug, adding the atoms together. This is
better single photon detectors.
the manufacturing plant. So at the moment, what you do is you just assemble the glassware together, and then you have some columns.
Manufacture the plant and then quantum teleportation.
Because I
You
work
need
for
quantum memory, which is the other thing you need.
It's a new economy. It's a new economy.
Yeah.
They only have all the principal activities.
You have to be able to store.
The only product was
So you send half a photon to store the other half, and then you have to wait for the channel to be secure.
Yeah,
And
it's
then
like missing.
you send one, and Alex does
It's definitely
the
transformative.
encoding.
Yeah.
And this other half.
Yeah, so you could also have this in the food industry, so the regulations are more so you know, print some hormones for farmers
That's actually the volume of material.
and pesticides and other different medicines that they use, antibiotics and things like that. All those are regulated. Then that's another problem.
not only
In
to
this
be
country, you are food
One of the other
disadvantages for chemicals like drugs.
Not enough money.
So do we need regulations and control?
Already, wasn't RSA encryption for a while considered to be military grade? Aren't there some restrictions that the US has on encryption technology exported to countries?
There's also export.
Right. Okay. Show time. So who would like to go? Who would like to go first? Any volunteers?
Export restrictions.
Anybody want to step back and leave somebody standing at the forefront? Yeah. Would you like to?
Yeah, we can go first. So it's 2.5
Okay.
minutes. Shall we? What we're going to do?
You don't do HDMI on that, do you?
No.
No. Sorry. You need an adapter or something.
Yeah.
I've got an adapter.
Let's see if I was clever enough to bring it.
Has it got a Thunderbolt? Has it got a Thunderbolt?
I don't know if you.
Oh, we have one of those. Manisha's got one.
Yeah.
You've got
Adapter work on mine, I think.
So we just all
Yeah.
go there, or?
Is it in everything?
Is beside you?
You might want to question general availability coming from because even if they're exporters from leads within the country, you want to question general availability.
Was there a
question mark because do you want
Are you C-type? It's a C-type bolt. It's one of those.
Not one of those.
Um,
It's certainly not that one. It's gunk. So I think that might. Let me just. I should probably clean it first. I'm not sure you want to put that in your
C-type
computer.
bolts, one of those guys.
Will that work? Because I've got one that I can
You want to close it?
I leave it here because
Who owns it?
Does that work?
Chris, you got it?
Oh, it's the, maybe that's not the one. No, it's this.
Hang on,
Okay.
am I VGA? Hang on, I'm VGA.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I'm VGA. So we don't have a VGA lead. So actually, that's not very helpful. No, don't put it in. Don't put it in. No, don't. We haven't got a VGA lead to connect
Right.
to anyway. So there's a fatal flaw in my plan.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, we will.
It's not really. We're just.
Unless you want to put it on a stick or something.
I
Because we have a
can if you have
connector.
one.
But yeah, sure.
If you have one, I'm very happy to transfer it over. Sorry, I didn't realise that we were going to be moving things across.
This one.
Oh, excellent. Yes,
Oh, wow.
we have the technology. Thank you to whoever that
Fantastic.
was.
Well done.
Right. So.
All right then.
Is that? Oh, goodness me. Oh, sorry, that's holiday. Right. Okay. So we picked the geoengineering assignment, and so the basic idea is that the speed with which a glacier collapses is to do with the space underneath it. We can have lots of warm water coming in, and that penetration of warm water accelerates the speed with which the glacier collapses, and so the idea is that if you can build a structure, a sill they call it, at the edge of the glacier, then that will stop the warm water getting underneath the glacier and then cause the glacier to sink, and then it will be a lot more stable. The hope is that that would mean that the glacier doesn't melt as quickly, and so you can all breathe a little bit more easily, because there are certain glaciers which have got huge amounts of water in them, which could account for about 5 meters of sea level rise. Up to 90. Okay, so quite a lot. So it's basically a huge construction project at the edge of this glacier. So obviously, it's one of its applications is stopping glaciers from melting. We also thought that maybe this might be used in other contexts, like maybe flood mitigation, river control, where those are fed by glaciers. So some way of kind of like trying to control the speed at which things melt. So potential positive outcomes. So the paper lists that there are maybe about 400 million people who live within 5 meters of sea level, so that's a lot. I would imagine, not that I'm an expert, that there's an awful lot of ecosystems and habitats which would be decimated by a 5 meter sea level rise, so mangrove forests and things like that, which might not be be retrievable after the sea level has rise by that much. Possibly more stable weather patterns as well. We're sort of like buffering some of the effects of climate change that might have a positive impact in other ways. They do put, so this is a modelling paper, so they try and put some kind of degree of certainty on their predictions, and basically how big this structure that you build will determine its effectiveness. And so the smallest version of this sill which you try to build could be 30% effective, as in 30% chance it might work, 70% chance it wouldn't work at all, not very much. And then the more extensive the structure, the more effective it is. So there's a reasonable chance of failure depending upon what you do. someone's going to make an awful lot of money. A new economy, I think so later on we did some maths as to how many tankers you'd need to fill with soil, and it was quite a lot, so if you're in shipping, then you're doing very well. Negative outcomes, somebody has to pay for it. We thought that maybe there's a disparity between the people who have the money and the people who would benefit from the structure, so that could be quite difficult politically if Paris is anything, the Paris Climate Change Agreement was anything to go by. Possible changes in ecosystems, both locally, not that I know anything about ecosystems without glaciers or nearby, but also you're going to be mining a lot of material from elsewhere and then moving it over, so everything along that route could be affected. Sovereignty issues, whose land is it? Who is it who's in charge? It might not work, and then possible negative perceptions if it didn't work. Money could be spent on something else, and as I say, we calculated that the smallest version, the one with a 30% chance of it actually working, would need about 10,000 oil tankers worth of aggregate. So that's quite a lot, it seems, or 1 million if you wanted to do the more effective version. You'd also have a sizable population of people down in Antarctica. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, don't know.
You didn't say that you'd have to buy a lot of shovels, though, did you?
A lot of shovels, yeah. I mean, we had pictures of people in our mind of just shoveling up the side of a ship. I don't know how you build something underwater.
Or a lot of machinery.
Yeah, a lot of robots.
Yeah. Big ones, not small. So stakeholders, international governments, especially those impacted by sea level rise, and this would have a very long sort of lead time. It seemed, to build something that big would presumably take a really long time, and it's going to take a really long time to figure out whether it's worked. So the predictions go out like 200 years hence. So priorities might change in that time. Then you've got to build it. Who's going to bid for it? What construction industry, mining industry is going to supply that. Pilot projects need to be carried out. There's a lot of stuff that needs to happen first. Are the outputs transformational or incremental, and for who? So we put this into positive and negative. So positive, arguably it could be positive. We thought it was an incremental improvement to a very big problem, which isn't. And what you're doing is you're trying to deal with one of the symptoms rather than the root cause, which is very good for these 400 million people, but you're not globally solving the problem. Possible negative outcomes: it might be a failure. It's dependent on future CO2 levels, which we don't know. So it's addressing the problem. May give people a false sense of security. So we've shored up that glacial melt problem, so we don't need to worry about changing CO2. What innovations are required? So doesn't reduce the need for CO2 abatement, so that needs to continue on. You need pilot projects. Scale-up might be an issue. CO2 emissions from moving material around. How do you build something at that kind of depth? It seems, again, I'm not a geotechnical engineer, but that seems to be quite hard. Do we need regulation? It would seem yes. I don't know where the evidence base for this would come from. This is just two people on a computer. I'm sure they're very clever, but I'm sure they need to do some experiments as well. There's the ecosystem change that might feed into those decisions. International regulations that might be required. Whether you're changing flows of seawater and what have you around the world, I don't know. Also, you've got an awful lot of construction going on as well, which would be difficult to manage, I expect. It would be off a ship in the Antarctic, so that would be quite hazardous, I think, for some people. So, it was an interesting one, that one.
Very good, thank you. Very, very comprehensive. The question is, should we do it? Subject to your regulations being put in place.
The thing that I got when I was reading this is like, well, okay, fine, it's a nice idea, but you need to have a better idea of what's going on. So, I who's going to do that and who's going to fund it and all those sorts of
What's come up before when we've looked at this is the issue of what else could you do? It's almost like, how do you appraise these projects on their cost and benefit? Because it, doesn't sound like a bad idea, but it's the largest civil engineering project humans have ever embarked upon. So that's not without its risks.
You mentioned the sovereignty of Antarctica. We've got something happening now with the Amazon forest.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, is it for us to be concerned and to force, or is it the country where the Amazon forest is from to decide what they do with their land as well?
Yeah.
It's always the.
It's a political thing, isn't it? Neoliberal economics.
Macron wouldn't be impressed.
I'm not saying. No, I'm just posing the question. I'm not saying I've got.
And then the question is, of course, how you pay for it. I mean, in this country we do things like an infrastructure levy. So for Crossrail, if you're seen to benefit economically from it, the whole area, you have to pay a little bit extra on your council tax to pay for Crossrail. Well, of course, this is potentially global impact. So do you charge everybody on the planet equally for the benefits they receive? So if you're living in a poor village on the coast of Bangladesh and you're not going to get flooded out, but you can't really afford to pay. You benefit most, and your ability to pay is least. So how do you deal with that? I mean, that's a real challenge, isn't it? It's a massive capital cost. Who pays?
It's a bit like if you haven't benefited from development in the past, should you be entitled to benefit from it in the same way in the future? If you see what I mean?
You might argue it's a first world problem.
Yeah.
If we've created all the CO2
That's
emissions
right,
that have caused most of the climate change, then should we not pay?
Yeah.
That's kind of how Paris climate arguments happen, isn't it? The developing countries saying, well, fair enough, but it was your, the integrated amount of CO2 emissions from America and the UK are huge. So do you want to solve the problem you created? So
indeed, yeah.
I was doing an RRI workshop in Chile, and we were talking to miners. And we got into a really big debate because we were an RRI project that got out to conduct like a workshop, and they really were strong on this, which isn't entirely unreasonable.
No.
They did have the point of how you're telling us how to solve the problem that we created.
But I mean, all projects raise it, but these big projects really bring these issues to the fore. It's actually less about the technical ability to deliver and much more about the kind of geopolitical issues that go along with it. And those, if you can't solve those, you can't build it.
Yeah.
So you can almost forget about whether it works or whether it's even if it did work, could you actually build it? That may make it totally unfeasible because of the complexity.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting point. What research should you do? The ability for the world to finance civil projects of a massive scale for climate change. So shouldn't you start there? And then once you know your ability to pay, you then scope projects you go off and research. Without that being worked on, I think the rest of it is pretty irrelevant, really. So it's not interesting, but anyway, thank you. That's really good.
No.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you to whoever let me this.
Great. Any volunteers?
Yeah.
Great.
While they're down there, do they extract some oil as well? Because that might be the after, yeah.
They're being ecologically friendly, hydrothermal.
Okay, so we did quantum secure direct communication, which was very nicely explained earlier by Darryl. So, but the essence of it is being able to communicate totally securely between sender and receiver by exploiting the laws of quantum mechanics, and in particular using quantum entanglement or entangled photon pairs as a way of communicating. So that's the sort of gist of it. The applications were that it enables this really secure, totally secure communication if you get it in theory, which will allow banks and the armies around the world, activists, state actors, terrorist criminals, all to do things that they would like to do. An interesting one that was raised, perhaps someone from my group might elaborate on this, was future-proofing communications. So
well, the theory goes that so current communications are done by something called RSA encryption, which is where you just take a very long number, which is the factor of two prime numbers, and so it's very difficult for computers to decrypt that communication, but it's very easy for a quantum computer to decrypt it. So the theory goes that that you take that encrypted communications and you just store them on a hard drive until you invent a quantum computer. And at that point, you can read those communications. So one of the selling points of quantum secure communications now is that some communications, even in 50 years' time, you still want them to be secure.
So they won't become vulnerable by the time you invent a quantum computer. I think a really nice example that was raised was, so people may be familiar with the Da Vinci surgical robot, where you can a surgeon can operate remotely. I think an operation was done in New York with the surgeon in Paris.
Monique, you did some work on that at King's, didn't you?
Yeah, we worked on the development.
Yeah. So if a hacker got involved in that channel, then they could seriously interfere with the process. But this would allow what was called hack-proof, for one of the better word, remote control. And you could apply that in a variety of places, telemedicine, I mentioned drones, any kind of nuclear industrial plant, or any kind of state infrastructure. So that would be another application.
That's an interesting use case actually for remote surgery.
So the outcomes, I think definitely increased security will benefit companies, hospitals, banks, military. There will be increased privacy potentially for consumers or patients, better security of your medical records, that kind of thing. A reduction in fraud, which again, banks and companies and government, people developing intellectual property, consumers again, they will all benefit from that. And you could envisage some authorized control of state assets that are maybe government run or military assets or indeed company assets. So this could enable really only authorized control over those assets. On the negative side, I think it's an enabler for. We thought it was an enabler for crime, particularly for organised crime. One might also feel overconfident. You might get complacent because you think you have really good security, but of course there are issues in quantum encryption that could be exploited if it was in the wrong hands or people knew what they were doing, and that would affect all these stakeholders. I think there is, because of the there are kind of reliability and applicability quite serious limitations, particularly when you compare it to today's methods of communicating, and that really affects everyone. It's an expensive technology, so that will impact on consumers. Everybody will be affected by the range. It's limited, I think, in that paper to tens of kilometres, or half a kilometre in the experiment and tens of kilometres in the proposal, and what they propose. And speed is definitely not what we're used to. So I think it was